Fantasy and elves are like peanut butter and jam. You can rarely have one without the other. And when you do, well, they're not exactly the same, are they? Was that a good analogy? It doesn't matter. I'm rolling with it anyways. And they also come in many different flavors. You know, you got jam, you got strawberry, you got raspberry, you got blackberry. You might even have a bit of grape mixed in there. Sorry, back to the topic. With elves, there are many different types because there are so many different ways in which elves in fantasy have been interpreted over time. From heavenly, ethereal beings of purity and goodness to shriveled up, squeaky, yet extremely powerful slaves, to even jolly, minuscule creatures packing up presents for St. Nicholas himself. It is mind blowing how many different depictions of these otherworldly beings we have been treated to. But in this video, what I want to do is take a look at different books, movies, games, etc., and at all the different portrayals of elves across fantasy to answer the question, who did elves best? The one I want to begin with, and the depiction of elves that you probably know best, is that of J.R.R. Tolkien. These ethereal beings, tall, fair skinned, and beautiful, creatures seemingly made of pure light, better than men, not really belonging on this earth, but rather their true home being in Valinor. This is a simple summary of elves in Tolkien's works, in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion, and other works in Middle Earth. Yet elves are so much more than that in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien has written extensively about their history and delving into specific key moments, key people, and places in the elves' history. The Silmarils, Beren and Luthien, the Kinslaying. All these moments so intricately told to us by Tolkien allows for this image of elves he created to stand out as the elves in fantasy. When you think of elves in fantasy, Galadriel, Elrond, Legolas, this is what you think of. But not all authors take the same route. For example, our next major interpretation, the complete antithesis of Tolkien's elves, J.K. Rowling's description of elves, or rather house elves. These creatures, 3 feet tall with squeaky voices and pale, spindly arms. Very different to how Tolkien saw them, because there is no way of describing them other than just ugly. And I am sorry to all the Dobby lovers out there. In fact, I am one of them. But house elves, well, they're not exactly pleasant to look at, are they? But where did these elves come from? Where were they inspired from? Well, interestingly enough, Rowling actually got the idea for them from old European folklore, a specific tale about the creature Brownie. Brownies were small goblin type creatures who slept during the day and came out to help with housework during the night. They were essentially little friendly spirit or fairy creatures that would come out at night and do chores for you in exchange for food like milk or bread. But put simply, if you piss them off, they'll make a mess. But if that's still not ringing a bell, if you ever left them clothes as a gift, then they put them on and disappear forever. Sound familiar? Probably does. So yes, J.K. Rowling was inspired by the legend of Brownie, but it is hard to ignore just how different these house elves are to Tolkien's. Although, I do have to say, I prefer Tolkien's interpretation of them. Interestingly enough, Tolkien's elves do also carry ties back to European folklore, or rather mythology. Norse mythology, to be in fact. Because the idea of elves we have today comes from Norse mythology. The elves in Norse mythology were called the Alfar and were believed to cause illness, have strong magic, and be very beautiful. A trait very obvious with Tolkien's elves as well. I mean, look at Legolas, that man is something else. Sorry, back to topic. However, Tolkien was also very clear in his description of them that they were not the traditional fairy tale elves. They were human sized and didn't carry the usual wings. Also, elsewhere in terms of books, a favourite of mine that I used to read as a kid was Artemis Fowl, and this was about a young boy called Artemis Fowl who was basically he was just a mastermind. And elves are also a big part of this story. They were essentially living underground, oppressed by humans all the way in the past, but they were elves. They had their own huge metropolis where they were essentially thousands of years in the future, way ahead of men, way ahead of the humans, and didn't like the humans. Not necessarily that they were scared of them, but they didn't like the humans. They were so far ahead with their technology and everything. That is another way of interpreting elves, which I really did like when I read Artemis Fowl book series as a kid. But moving on then to gaming instead and away from books, to one of my favorite video games ever, Skyrim. Because in Skyrim, the player has the option of playing 4 different types of elves. To begin with, we have the Aldmer, also known as the First Folk, who are the very first elven race in the Elder Scrolls universe. The Aldmer are widely considered to be the first highly intelligent race in Nirn, with the ancient beast species refraining from using any forms of technology. However, in the game I'm talking about, Skyrim, the latest installment in the Elder Scrolls universe, they are gone. No longer a proper species and they basically died out. And then we have the Altmer, or the High Elves. These High Elves can immediately be recognized from their golden complexion and their tall stature. The Altmer have garnered a reputation across Tamriel as being rather arrogant, openly considering themselves to be the most sophisticated race around, which definitely does sound a lot similar to Tolkien, because his elves were essentially high elves. And the Altmer are chiefly known for their impressive ability to master the art of the arcane, and many Altmer spend their extended lifespans learning all there is to know about Magicka. But without going into too much detail on the other types, because that would be simply go on for just too long, we have wild elves, dark elves, wood elves, snow elves, sea elves, with other races such as the orcs also existing. The interpretation of these elves by Bethesda are quite hard to summarize due to each type of elf having their own look, features, and abilities, with some types being, well, maybe less than desirable. This is a take that we do see a lot in fantasy, however, with lots of different types of elves for different things. For example, wood elves, sea elves, moon elves, sun elves, and more, which is a common theme in this really enjoyable TV series on Netflix. It's pretty small. The fandom is also pretty small, called The Dragon Prince. I also do recommend that checking that out. That's just full-blooded fantasy, and there are so many different types of elves. You have the moon elves, specifically, who live their own way of life compared to the sun elves, who live in a completely different way, in a completely different place. But now then, let's look at Dungeons and Dragons, a game which I very much enjoy, and well, it's got a lot to do with fantasy, as you can imagine. In D&D, it follows a similar pattern where you can choose to be an elf, but then you have all these different sub-races and cultures. The main ones are, of course, high elves, wood elves, and dark elves, but there are so many more. Firstly, we have deep elves, then you have moon elves, snow elves, sun elves, valley elves, wild elves, winged elves, aquatic elves, grey elves, pallid elves, sea elves, shadow elves, and fey elves, and that's not all. So it really does give you an idea and show the variety of elves on offer. By the way, do you ever say a word so much that it doesn't even sound like a word anymore? I just said the word elves so many times in the last 30 seconds. It sounds so weird in my mouth now. But back to it, one very common theme that fantasy follows is that elves are one big race, which are split into different smaller factions almost, with all the different types living in places and biomes that suit them. Even Tolkien does this, with wood elves living in Lothlorien being the obvious example. Overall, though, it is impossible to put a number on the different ways in which elves can be included in a story, whether it be fantasy or not. As you've seen when we looked at D&D and the elves there are so many different types with different elves for particular biomes. But the two overarching interpretations, if you will, the two that are most commonly known and probably come to your mind when you think the word elf, is either Tolkien's portrayal of them in the Lord of the Rings and extended works like the Silmarillion and Beren and Luthien, or the idea of Christmas elves, the jolly, tiny little creatures that spend their entire year in green and red suits making toys to please the big man himself, Santa Claus. This idea is promoted through the relentless amount of Christmas movies you see involving Santa being real or something of that sort, where these elves are very commonly found. But their origin does go back much further than that, something I do want to briefly touch upon. You see, Christmas elves, as we know them, can be traced back to around the mid 1800s, where they were first shown in the 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, or better known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. In the poem, Santa is described as a right jolly old elf, and one of the illustrators of the poem, by the name of Thomas Nast, showed Santa's helpers as small elves, paving the way for the idea of the North Pole as one huge workshop, where Santa's team of tiny elves help him to make toys for deserving young boys and girls. Then we have elsewhere elves in German folklore, arguably where they originated, because you see, in medieval Germanic speaking cultures, elves were thought of as beings with magical powers and supernatural beauty, ambivalent towards everyday people and capable of either helping or hindering them. But this is all real life folklore, stories from past ages, yet these tales, old European tales, have bled their way into fantasy, making elves a staple of every single fantasy and even fiction novel, game, and book. But the question is, who does it best? Ultimately, I'm going to go, as you might have suspected, with Tolkien on this one. Because though there are so many different ways to view this in terms of who did it best, Tolkien's interpretation of them is simply too iconic to turn down. Additionally, the sheer amount of detail he went into with the elves is unbelievable. Not only did he write multiple books detailing their history and specific important points in their past, he also created not one, but two full languages for the elves, called Quenya and Sindarin respectively. That is simply unbelievable, and he made it before actually writing The Lord of the Rings itself, which is nothing short of admirable. Also, Tolkien's writings have given way over time for some of the most iconic characters of all time in fantasy. Elrond, Galadriel, Legolas, these are characters that will never be forgotten, whether it be because of the books or films, but there are so many interpretations of elves out there, with each author, each movie maker, each game designer having their own idea and own opinion on the creatures. So, in respect to that, make sure to tell me in the comments your favourite version of the elves, or if you agree with mine. Also, if you would like this to become a series where we cover other fantasy creatures, origins, and different types, such as dwarves, goblins, centaurs, giants, dragons, fairies, halflings, or even trolls, make sure to tell me in the comments below. But that's all for today. Please make sure to subscribe. We're a growing channel and it would help hugely. Thanks for watching. Darth Sauron out.